The world was stunned when news broke from Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young and fiery leader of the country, had ordered the United Nations peacekeepers to pack up and leave. For years, the UN had maintained a presence in Burkina Faso under the banner of stabilizing the Sahel, fighting terrorism, and supporting humanitarian missions. But Traoré's sudden announcement has shaken not just Burkina Faso, but the entire African continent and even the Western powers who closely watch this region. At first glance, it seems like a bold, almost reckless move. After all, the UN is usually seen as a symbol of stability, neutrality, and protection. Why would any leader want to expel them? To understand Traoré's decision, we have to rewind the clock and trace the deep mistrust, the hidden failures, and the political calculations that led to this explosive moment. A country under siege, Burkina Faso, is no stranger to violence. For nearly a decade, the nation has been caught in the crossfire of jihadist insurgencies spreading across the Sahel from Mali and Niger. Villages have been burned, thousands killed, and millions displaced. People live in fear, unsure if tomorrow will bring safety or tragedy. In such chaos, the UN peacekeepers, specifically the MINUSMA mission in the region, were expected to provide stability. They were supposed to shield civilians, support the government, and strengthen the fight against militants. But for many Burkinabe citizens, the results were painfully disappointing. Attacks continued. Terrorists gained ground. And in some cases, people accused the UN of standing by and doing nothing while atrocities unfolded. Whispers began to grow louder. What exactly are these peacekeepers doing here? Traoré's rise and promise. Enter Ibrahim Traoré. In 2022, he seized power with a clear message. Enough is enough. The young captain presented himself as a patriot who would not tolerate Burkina Faso being a playground for foreign powers or a victim of endless UN reports with no real action. He positioned himself as a man of action, not words. His speeches carried fire. His tone carried defiance. And above all, he promised to restore sovereignty. For the Burkinabe people, exhausted by years of war and disappointment, Traoré's rise felt like a fresh wind. But to fulfill his promise, Traoré had to make choices that would shock the old system. Expelling the French military bases was the first step. Now, pushing out the UN peacekeepers was the second and far more dramatic move, the breaking point. So, what triggered this final decision? According to officials close to the government, the Burkinabe leadership had grown increasingly frustrated. They claimed that UN peacekeepers often imposed restrictions, limited military operations, and sometimes even protected Western interests more than local people. Traoré, who has consistently pushed for an Africa free from external domination, began to see the UN not as a friend, but as another chain holding his country down. Then came reports that peacekeepers were clashing with local forces, refusing to share intelligence, and failing to prevent massacres in rural areas. The patience snapped. In a fiery speech, Traoré declared, "We no longer need actors who pretend to keep peace while our people continue to die. Burkina Faso will defend itself, with dignity, with courage, and with true partners who respect us." And just like that, the expulsion order was signed. The world reacts. The reaction was immediate and intense. Western capitals expressed concern and warned that Burkina Faso was isolating itself. Analysts on TV called the decision dangerous. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the capital, crowds cheered. Citizens waved flags and chanted Traoré's name. For them, this was not a step toward chaos. It was a step toward freedom. The E. Symbolism was powerful, a young African leader kicking out the UN itself. Something rarely seen, something unthinkable a decade ago. Traoré had just sent a message to the world. Burkina Faso belongs to Burkinabe, not to outsiders. But what comes next? Of course, questions hang heavy in the air. Without the UN, who will fill the vacuum? Will Burkina Faso stand stronger, or will it be left vulnerable to terrorist groups? Will Russia or other non-Western partners step in, as they have in Mali? This is where the story gets even more interesting and even more dangerous. In the next part, we'll uncover how Traoré's move fits into the larger battle for Africa's future, the tug-of-war between East and West, and the dangerous gamble of relying on new allies. Because when a leader expels the UN, it doesn't just change local politics. It shakes the balance of global power. When Ibrahim Traoré announced the expulsion of the United Nations peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, from Burkina Faso, the world was stunned. To many outside observers, the decision looked abrupt, even reckless. But for millions inside Burkina Faso, it felt like the final step in a long-brewing conflict between their country and the international powers that claimed to be helping them. So what led to this dramatic fallout? Why did Traoré and his government decide that the UN was no longer welcome? A mismatch of expectations. When MINUSMA first arrived in the Sahel, its purpose was clear: stabilize the region, protect civilians, and support counter-terrorism efforts. But from the very beginning, there was a gap between promises and reality. Villagers living in northern Burkina Faso, those closest to the violence, expected security, patrols, and quick responses to extremist attacks. Instead, they often complained that peacekeepers were more focused on paperwork, reports, and diplomatic meetings in capital cities than actual protection in rural zones. For Traoré, who came to power on the promise of defending his people, this became a serious credibility issue. Accusations against UN forces over the years, resentment against UN peacekeepers grew. Local communities and civil groups accused them of being slow to respond during attacks, passive observers instead of active defenders, sometimes even blocking Burkinabe forces from pursuing extremists. There were even moments when villagers questioned, whose side are they really on? Traoré himself publicly voiced frustration that the UN seemed more interested in monitoring and criticizing government actions than in fighting terrorism head-on. The rise of nationalism. At the same time, a new wave of African nationalism was rising across the continent. In Mali, the military-led government had already ordered UN peacekeepers out, accusing them of failing to protect civilians. Niger, too, was beginning to voice similar doubts. Traoré, inspired by this momentum, framed his decision as part of a broader struggle for sovereignty. In his speeches, he made it clear: Burkina Faso will decide its own path. We will not be dictated to by outsiders who do not live our reality. For him, the UN presence had become a symbol of dependency, something he wanted to break free from: security versus sovereignty. The Burkinabe leadership argued that keeping UN troops meant ceding authority over security operations to outsiders. This clashed directly with Traoré's vision of rebuilding a strong national army that answers only to its people. Military analysts noted that Traoré was pushing for mass recruitment of volunteers to fight extremists. Closer military ties with neighboring Sahel states instead of global institutions. Partnerships with non-traditional allies, like Russia, for weapons and training. The UN, on the other hand, insisted on long-term negotiations, peace talks, and human rights monitoring. The two visions were simply incompatible. The breaking point. The final straw came when UN officials criticized Burkina Faso's handling of civilian militias and demanded more transparency in military operations. To Traoré, this was not just criticism, it was interference. He believed the UN was undermining his government at a time when unity was crucial. Soon after, his administration officially demanded the withdrawal of UN peacekeepers. The message was loud and clear. We no longer need foreign guardians. Burkina Faso will defend itself. Global shockwaves. This decision triggered mixed reactions globally. Western governments warned that Burkina Faso was isolating itself. African youth movements celebrated it as a bold stand for sovereignty. Security experts worried that the vacuum left by the UN could make the region even more unstable. But one thing was undeniable. Traoré had shifted the balance of power. His move wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was a statement for the entire Sahel and even Africa at large. The bigger picture: by expelling UN forces, Traoré is gambling on a new security model, one built on local mobilization, regional alliances, and selective foreign partnerships. Supporters see it as a chance for true independence. Critics fear it could worsen violence if national forces fail to fill the gap. What's certain is that this decision has set Burkina Faso on a path with no turning back. When we look at the timeline, one thing becomes very clear. The relationship between Burkina Faso's leadership and the United Nations peacekeeping mission wasn't always this bitter. In the early days, peacekeepers were seen as a shield, an international force that could buy time for the country's own army to grow stronger. But as the years rolled by, cracks began to appear. For ordinary Burkina-based citizens, the blue helmets of the UN started to lose their shine. Villages were still being attacked, terrorists still roamed freely, and in many regions, people felt completely abandoned despite the heavy international presence. The frustration built up like a ticking time bomb. The people's frustration. Imagine living in a small town in northern Burkina Faso. Every night you hear gunfire echoing in the distance. Every week, another village is burned, another family is displaced. Now imagine that right outside your town, there's a UN base filled with armored vehicles, soldiers, and advanced technology. Yet when the terrorists come, the peacekeepers rarely step outside the base. That was the reality many citizens complained about. They asked, why are they here if they won't fight? For locals, the UN looked like an expensive guest who contributed little to security. And for Traoré, who built his legitimacy on protecting the nation, this perception was dangerous. Traoré's ideological stand. Traoré is not just a military officer. He represents a wave of African leaders who reject what they see as foreign, babysitting. His speeches often highlight self-determination, dignity, and sovereignty. In his view, Burkina Faso should not rely on outsiders who, in his words, do not share our pain. The breaking point came when several attacks killed dozens of civilians despite the UN's large presence. Traoré openly questioned the mission's effectiveness. If after years of deployment, terrorists are still gaining ground, then what purpose does the mission serve? For him, the answer was obvious. The UN was not a solution. It had become part of the problem. Rising nationalism. At the same time, a new spirit of nationalism was rising among Burkinabe youth. Demonstrations in the capital Ouagadougou often carried slogans like, "We don't need outsiders to defend us," or "Africa for Africans." Many protesters waved Russian flags or demanded alliances outside the traditional Western sphere. This popular pressure gave Traoré the political backing he needed. By the time he announced the expulsion of the UN mission, the crowd in the streets cheered. What looked shocking abroad seemed like a victory at home. Geopolitical echoes, of course. Such a bold move does not stay confined within borders. The decision sent shockwaves across the region and the world. Other countries in the Sahel, like Mali and Niger, were already rethinking their relationships with Western forces. Traoré's move seemed to confirm a trend, a new Sahelian resistance to foreign influence. International reactions were mixed. Some diplomats called the decision reckless, warning that Burkina Faso was isolating itself. Others said the move was inevitable, given the UN's declining popularity on the ground. But for Traoré, none of this mattered. He framed it as a moral and patriotic stand. In his speeches, he presented himself as the guardian of national pride, someone willing to take risks to break what he sees as chains of dependency. A turning page. The expulsion of UN peacekeepers was not just a tactical decision, it was symbolic. It marked the end of one chapter and the start of another. From now on, Burkina Faso would stand on its own, or at least seek new partnerships outside the usual UN framework. For better or worse, Traoré had drawn a line in the sand. The world was now watching closely to see whether Burkina Faso could survive or even thrive without international peacekeepers. And this brings us to the next part. What happens now? Who steps in to fill the gap left by the UN, and what risks lie ahead for Traoré and his country? So far, we've traced the story of why Ibrahim Traoré decided to expel UN peacekeepers, how it connects to a deeper dissatisfaction with international interventions, and what the immediate reactions have been. But now comes the most critical part of this unfolding story. What does the future look like for Burkina Faso without UN troops? Will Traoré's gamble pay off or backfire? And what does this mean for Africa's broader struggle against neo-colonial influence? Let's break this down step by step. A leap into the unknown by removing the United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, MINUSMA-style presence in Burkina Faso, Traoré has effectively told the world, we will handle our own destiny with our own hands. This is not a small move. It's like taking the training wheels off a bicycle when the road ahead is rocky, steep, and full of obstacles. The UN, while often criticized for being slow and ineffective, still brought some level of logistical and international backing. Now, without them, the full weight of security falls on Traoré's administration and the Burkinabe armed forces. This is a gamble with history. If Traoré succeeds, he will cement his image as a bold leader who defied global powers and restored sovereignty. If he fails, critics will point and say, see, this is why you needed foreign peacekeepers. 2. The security gamble. Let's be real. Burkina Faso is still facing some of the most violent insurgencies in Africa, with militants tied to ISIS and Al-Qaeda active in the north and east. Attacks on villages, ambushes on roads, and raids on military. Outposts remain a near-weekly reality. The UN wasn't winning this war, but they were a buffer. Now that buffer is gone. So how will Traoré try to fill the gap? 3 key moves stand out. Strengthening the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP. These are local civilian defense groups. Think of them as community militias trained and armed by the government. Expanding their role means giving ordinary villagers a stake in their own defense, but it also risks abuses and poor coordination. Deepening military cooperation with Russia. We've already seen this in Mali. After UN troops left, Wagner and other Russian private military groups stepped in. While Russia promises effective results, critics warn of heavy-handed tactics and resource exploitation. Will Burkina Faso walk the same path? Signs suggest yes. Tightening regional security ties, alliance of Sahel states. Traoré is part of a new regional alliance with Mali and Niger, 2 other countries that also broke from France and the West. Together, they're trying to build a new security bloc, independent from the UN and ECOWAS pressures. This is a high-risk strategy, but it's also a high-reward one. If the alliance stabilizes their borders and beats back insurgents, Traoré's legacy will shine across Africa. The international fallout now, let's zoom out. Expelling the UN isn't just a local decision, it has global consequences. At the UN headquarters in New York, officials are worried this sets a precedent. If one African nation after another starts saying, "No thanks, UN," the very model of international peacekeeping could collapse. In Western capitals, Paris, Washington, Brussels, there's frustration and even anger. To them, this is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about losing influence in Africa. With Russia and China stepping in, the West fears being locked out of Africa's future. In Africa itself, the reactions are mixed. Some governments quietly cheer Traoré for standing up against outside interference. Others worry that without the UN, chaos will spill across borders, making the entire region harder to stabilize. This is why Traoré's move is being called a domino moment. If Burkina Faso manages to survive and strengthen, others will follow. If it collapses, leaders will think twice. The symbol of sovereignty. Here's the deeper point. For Traoré, this isn't just about security, it's about symbolism. For decades, African countries have been told they cannot stand on their own 2 feet without help from international powers. The UN presence, while framed as peacekeeping, often looked like a form of guardianship, as if African nations were perpetual children in need of babysitters. By expelling the UN, Traoré is sending a loud message. Burkina Faso will not be anyone's experiment. We decide our own path. And that's why, even if things get tougher in the short run, his popularity among ordinary Africans is skyrocketing. People see him as a leader who is reclaiming dignity. The challenges. Ahead, of course, symbolism alone won't win battles. Here are the 3 biggest challenges Traoré now faces. Resource strain. Fighting insurgencies without UN logistics means Burkina Faso must invest heavily in its own supply lines, weapons, and intelligence. This will cost money the state doesn't really have. Human rights risks. The expanded role of community militias, VDP, could lead to ethnic violence, civilian abuses, and cycles of revenge. Without the UN monitoring presence, who will hold them accountable? Balancing East and West. If Traoré leans too heavily on Russia, he risks replacing one form of dependency, France, UN, with another, Moscow. Will Burkina Faso truly be independent, or just shift its patron? These are not small questions. The answers will shape not just Burkina Faso, but the entire Sahel region's future. The big picture. When historians look back, the decision to expel the UN will be seen as one of the defining moments of Traoré's rule. If he stabilizes the country, Burkina Faso will be hailed as a pioneer of a new sovereign Africa. If instability deepens, critics will call it reckless bravado. Either way, this is more than just about Burkina Faso. It's about the future of how Africa engages with the world. Final thoughts. So, why did Traoré expel the UN peacekeepers? Because he believes sovereignty is worth the risk. Because he wants to chart a new course for Burkina Faso, one where international actors are no longer pulling the strings. And because he sees a chance to inspire a whole generation of Africans to say, we can fight our own battles, we can solve our own problems, and we can control our own destiny. The question now is, will the gamble pay off? Only time will tell. But one thing is clear. This move has already changed the conversation about Africa's future forever.